Hello, those of you who are here and those of you who are not, who are here only in spirit and or concept. My name is William Wyatt. This is the meeting of the Guerrilla Philosophy Club at CSUS. And today we have a very special presentation by a returning guest who is Professor Pelletti from Sacramento State and from other universities, I think, if I recall correctly. The title of today's talk, presentation, etc., is Leibniz, Public Health, subtitle, Asking the Right Questions. We're going to be interrogating how we understand public health, I think. For those of you who aren't in the know already, Leibniz is like the guy that this polymath professor did his thesis on. Polymath? Polyglot? I forget. Both wonderful. So expect like a very knowledgeable presentation. I don't know for sure how in-depth it's going to be in terms of Leibniz specifically, but I know for sure that it's a very timely discussion to be having. I mean, it has always been, but it is especially this decade. Okay, that's it for me. I think without further ado, I'll give the microphone to Professor Pelletti.
All right, yeah, and thank you, William and Daniel, for organizing it and for the people who show up. You know, I'm glad you guys keep this going. I get a big kick out of Leibniz and his work here on public health that I want to share with some key text. What I think is a lot of fun here is Leibniz himself does not know medicine. So he's not able to do the studies himself. There's interesting parallels to surprisingly large number of disciplines: history writing, paleontology, other topics as well, where Leibniz is able to make direct contributions because he's simply brilliant and able to make those contributions. But with medicine, he's not. He never did learn much in the way of very rudimentary understanding of medicine. Yet his same understanding of sciences in general and human knowledge allowed him to sharpen questions to an immeasurable extent. And it led to the world's first epidemiological study. Now, when I first presented that work, when I first gave a presentation on Leibniz, I've given a few. I've read a paper at a conference on this topic, and I've spoken once about 5 years ago on this topic at a previous philosophy club. And I'd have to explain what epidemiological means. I think now we all know it. Okay, epidemiology has become a household word, but you're going to discover the first study of epidemiology in 1690, and that it was actually designed by Leibniz, but carried out by a doctor, all right, an authentically good doctor. All right, so let me go, I'll go and do it. I'll do a little share screen. I assume I have a screen share that's optional here. And slideshow from current slide. All right, that should show up just fine for everybody. And this is another interesting twist. We always have kind of an assumption that what we are working, that we're older than we are. One of the really interesting things, I think, to be alive at this point in history with a real good historical understanding is we're so early in civilization. Really, it was only about 6,000 years ago we figured out agriculture. We finally figured out evolution just over 100 years ago. The genome was finally decoded, just 20 years ago. We are in an incredibly young period of humanity. I mean, it'd be interesting how people not 1,000 years from now will think about us, but 20,000 years from now. So kind of project your mind that, and you get to see how young our activities are. Leibniz has a sense of this. Most of the people, basically everybody he's interacting with, do not. And this really emerges out here. So the translations, this is going to all appear in English, but these are written in Italian, German, French, and Latin. Okay, so the actual text on Leibniz and medicine are really scattered among several different notes. But I want to start with a different document that is not read, but gives us a different sense of Leibniz. And this is a I'll read it in English, Memoir for Enlightened Persons of Good Intentions. It probably was written around 1696, 97. It never was published. In it, and in his role as a scholar and politician, he calls upon governments to establish scientific societies. He was the founder and first president of the German Society of Science, for the record. Just after this, he achieved that goal. And he pushed scholars, to quote, to conduct research and experiments in order to advance as much as possible in the future. So he really wants to advance our understanding. His own beliefs are surprisingly flexible and unclear, because I don't think Leibniz really felt he had, with that sense of history, think of your understanding of human knowledge right now, which you're confident about, and then project your mind forward again for 30,000, not just 1,000 years, but 30,000 years. And I think you would have a lot more modesty. And that's really how he is thinking. His own beliefs, he realizes, are not terribly important. He's trying to push us towards the future, to accelerate that, as he thinks that humanity will be more thriving in the future. And he's also conscious that this has to be done by many people, that he can't do it by himself. Little quote here. I would normally call, it's not a class, I'll read it myself. Okay. All right. Quote, moreover, what is the most important? 1,000 things can be done by 2 or 3 or several who work together, which will never be done, or never be done well, if they work without communicating with one another. Leibniz never wanted to write a magnus opus like Bertrand Russell assumed he would want to, and was surprised he did not. Leibniz never saw himself as functioning in isolation. His work was always done. I've suggested that we should always understand the predicate to write for Leibniz, you've got logic students here, as a predicate with 3 arguments. Leibniz writes this document for this person, this reason. You always have to keep that in mind. Sometimes he'd write for himself, but he would only publish if he thought, or send as a letter, if he thought it would be conducive to understanding and develop or deepen our understanding. This is the lesson that Leibniz learned in developing calculus, I think, when he was still pretty young. Now, Newton beat him to it. Newton invented calculus first. The key understanding that integrals and the differential equations are inverse relations to one another. That was done by Newton in the 1660s. But in the 1670s, Leibniz reached the same point. But Newton kept his techniques private. He did not share them with anybody. He was just happy to solve problems other people could not. Leibniz got all excited by his discovery and created a team to perfect the understanding, to perfect the notation. And by the 1690s, 1692, I think, de l'Hôpital wrote the first calculus textbook, which is very similar to a textbook we still use in colleges today. The direct ancestor chapters are practically still the same. Okay, that fast, in just 20 years. But it was a whole bunch of guys working together. It was, 12 of them or so that were really working on developing calculus. Many of the names forgotten today, but at the time, quite known. Varignon, Bernoulli, they're still somewhat known. And it was really beautiful. And I think that's the real key. So who cares whether it was Leibniz or Newton who got there first? Who moved mathematics forward the most? There's no question, Leibniz. See, and that's the goal. The goal is not to say, I did this first, okay, aren't I great? But how much have you really contributed to pushing our understanding forward? That's his thinking, yeah. He also warns against excessive specialization in that same document because he thinks people working in different areas need to be able to share their results and to see things from different perspectives, which is kind of obvious. And finally, and what could be a proverb, he writes, this was written in French initially, un seul homme est peu de choses au prix de l'union de plusieurs. One man counts for little in comparison to the joint effort of many. So think of that team. Yeah, so it's not just empty words. He puts this into action. All right. Now with that as a backdrop, I think we can follow. Now, I looked at several areas in my thesis where Leibniz worked in the sciences to obtain great and underappreciated results. His work in paleontology and geology were great, for example, and almost never read, but historically quite important. Perhaps medicine, though, I think is really the most interesting. And as I said, it's because he really had to depend on others yet was still asking the right questions. Also, medicine is interesting. All of the sciences, bar two, all of the sciences in universities today, bar two, come out of philosophy. So all of them were once part of philosophy, and then they progressively split off and they become physics and astronomy, psychology. All of these were once part of philosophy. The two exceptions, and both are fun. One, my favorite in some ways, is chemistry, which arose from magic and alchemy. Okay, so this transformation of substances. So I just think that's kind of fun. Almost makes me want to be a chemist. And the second is medicine. And medicine is just, we always were interested in health. So medicine is equally as old as philosophy. Hippocrates and Socrates were actually contemporaries. But he's taken a view on medicine that's really interesting. So everybody who works in medicine sees themselves as engaged in this ancient art. All right, this goes back to antiquity. They've got their theory, they've got their model. They sometimes even make people better. Okay, not very often. And Leibniz comes in and says, no, 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 you guys are all wrong. You're not an ancient art. To modernize a little bit his vocabulary, he was basically arguing you're a very, very young science. And you need to change your conceptions to appreciate that, so we actually end up with better outcomes. All right. Now, also, remember, Leibniz is basically a prime minister for Hanover, informal diplomat and consultant to the Holy Roman Empire in Vienna, to the Kingdom of Prussia, and even to not actually the royal house of France, but it's who might take over France potentially in the future, the princely house of Orleans. He was working more or less as a counselor and a diplomat with all of these political groups. And to bring about a program of public health can't be done by an individual. It's not an individual discovery. He actually has to establish scientific societies. He actually has to get a whole team of people thinking differently and asking different questions. And where are we at here when he's working in the 1680s, 1690s? We're still in the period where doctors studied Hippocrates and Galen, ancient Greek, ancient Roman. Galen's around the year 200. And if their work has some interesting parts to it, it's and quite interesting to place in their historical context of antiquity, they're still really big shortcomings. They still practice, and still being practiced, the theory of the four humors. You're sick. Well, probably because of, oh, you're going to like this term. This is before the germ theory of disease. So you become sick thanks to miasmas, which are basically, which arise due to malaria. Malaria literally meaning bad air. Okay, so ventilate your places better, make sure you have good air. They don't understand the role of pathogens. So due to malaria, bad air, okay, you have an imbalance in your four humors, your blood, your yellow bile, black bile, phlegm, and we have to correct it. All right, so if you don't have enough blood, you have to drink wine, okay? I finished mine already, so I should be good on that. If you have too much black bile, I don't know what you have to do. You have to, too much phlegm, you have to have fresher air, or yellow bile, you have to spend time in Italy, whatever. I mean, they have ways of trying to, or they might have to bleed you. If you have too much blood, they got to put leeches on you. Yeah, and they have, purgatives, bloodletting. Those were the standard emetics. These were the standard treatments to get your humors back into balance. Now, individual discoveries were making progress. We had improved our anatomy with Vesalius in 1543. where he did a lot of dissections, pointed out that Galen actually dissected monkeys. He didn't dissect humans because some of the anatomy he discovered was wrong. And with William Harvey, we discovered the circulation of the blood. All right. Now, before I go on with those, that's about half of the presentation here in some ways. Any questions on that opening or any reflections?
I guess it's very interesting. I'm drawn to the idea, right, that that Leibniz is developing here meta-philosophically, which is you have to get lots of people in on the philosophical project to make it work and to make it impactful. What stands out to me is I think, like, at least my reading of the events is that that idea was kind of rediscovered in sort of philosophy that's contemporary with us in the last, a couple decades, in like feminist philosophy, where the ethos now is more or less non-individualistic. You have lots of different thinkers contributing their ideas, and so the courses developed around feminist philosophy do not reflect a couple of big names. They reflect lots of thinkers with lots of contributions made by individuals, without really emphasizing like one big deal thinker, And I kind of think that's probably the right way to do it. We had a raised hand.
Yeah, I saw two of them. Was it because of the youngness of the of feminism, do you think?
I suspect so. Like feminist philosophy starts to really come into its own. I mean, again, this is just my reading of it, but like, I think that feminist philosophy kind of started to come into its own and become a more well-recognized and substantiated by people academic discipline in the time when academia was more accessible to more people, right? Where, basically by virtue of being younger, it becomes more inclusive just because it occurs in a somewhat more inclusive academic environment, as opposed to like ancient philosophy, which was a handful of dudes who had the economic privilege of doing philosophy rather than working a farm,
Yeah. Okay. And it's much, when we present that kind of class, it's much more ancient, much more established, or even philosophy of language really is grounded in work that's 50, 60 years old, at least. Shaleya, I saw your hand come up. I'd love to hear your voice.
Shailaja.
I never could pronounce your name. You know that.
It's all good. I lost my train of thought. It wasn't very significant anyway. It's all good. Thank you. How are you doing?
All right. Don't hesitate to
see if you can remember it. We'll struggle back.
Daniel, you.
Sort of, I guess, then the bouncing off of William's thought a little bit, not specifically about feminist philosophy, but like generally within academia, like more broadly now, kind of I thought it was just a contemporary phenomenon. Sort of the hip new theme is intersectionality. If you can make your research intersectional and cross-discipline, that it's sort of it gets people having it. It's sort of the thing of the new millennium. But what I'm gathering from this then is that it's almost kind of like a return to form or return to tradition almost after a fashion. It's not really new after all.
I have to admit I have a certain cynicism about that too, by the way. I'm afraid that they may say that, but there are too few people who actually master well enough different disciplines to actually, most people just won't understand what you're doing. Okay. If you really try intersectionality, even if I think everybody here has had a class with me and you kind of know my approaches, but I think it's hard if when you see things from different angles, you kind of do limit the number of people who will follow your work, unfortunately. All right, let's discover the first epidemiological study here. So Leibniz travels to the town of Modena at the last day of 1689, and he spends the month of January there. And while there, he meets a guy who was a man who will soon become famous, Bernardo Ramazzini. And they discuss medicine and the ideas of Leibniz. They basically, I forget the exact date, it's some of the first week of January. They spend the night talking about how to advance medicine and what needs to be done. Leibniz has all of these ideas. Ramazzini, as would soon be discovered, is brilliant. And after that talk with Leibniz, Ramazzini says to writes to another one of his friends, Moglidiacci, that he will do everything he can to serve Leibniz. That essentially, Ramazzini is completely won over to the project and is just super, super enthusiastic. And what's even more beautiful, he actually carries out these ideas. All right, so he's really impressed and he acts on them in a super powerful way. So what Leibniz laid out was the concept of an epidemiological study in the northern Italy area around the town of Modena, where Ramazzini worked. And in 1690 and in 1691, Ramazzini published 2 short studies, never reprinted, never translated. Luckily, the French National Library has copies, and I could get my grubby little hands on them. Okay, they were interesting to read. And they are basically, as far as we know, the world's first epidemiological studies. And really, in many ways, I think one of the key moments in the birth of modern medicine. It's hard to know exactly where to place that, but it is a key moment. He dedicates the work, quote, to that most distinguished and celebrated man, Leibniz, of course. Okay, so, all right. And now we have data, and patterns become observable. This is so easy, it's ridiculous in some ways, but nobody was looking at the data. Nobody was looking at the patterns that emerged. In 1690, a wet year, Ramazzini's favorite treatment was cinchona bark, which is fairly effective with malaria and is a precursor to quinine. He noticed in that first year, it was ineffective. But in the second year, a dry year, I should be 1691 there, it worked wonders and was back being the wonder drug that he thought cinchona bark was. What happened here, I think, looking at the symptoms and as he describes them, and also the weather that he describes in northern Italy at that time, in 1690, he was probably dealing with the flu. And cinchona bark will do absolutely nothing for the flu. It'll be useless. And in 1691, slightly warmer year, a little bit drier, mosquitoes would work their way that far north in Italy at this time. And he probably was dealing with simply malaria. And once again, it is a reasonable treatment for malaria, is the good as they had at the time. Now, his studies and his idea of looking at populations, collecting data, habits of data, what they were eating, what they were drinking. Leibniz describes all this. You know, what kind of beer do they have? Does the beer make them, how does the beer operate on them? What kind of jobs are they doing? These are the questions he wanted Ramazzini to be investigating, and Ramazzini continued this. And in 1700, he publishes De Morbis Artificum on the diseases of workers, and this is the birth of industrial medicine. Now, by industrial medicine, this is what we mean by that is you have diseases according to the professions that you exercise. So miners have black lung. Printers have diseases associated with being printers. When we all wrote on a typewriter, we all had metacarpal issues. And that's the kind of thing that Ramazzini is studying on the diseases of workers, and it leads to better treatments, better understanding, the risk of certain professions. Again, he was collecting the data, clear patterns were emerging. But the principal work for me was really 1690 and 1691, laying out the principles of describing carefully the conditions, collecting data for the whole population, comparing it, not treating people on an individual base, but as part of a public health project. And the work was done by Ramazzini, but it was inspired by Leibniz, especially when seen as part of the larger pattern. Another little document, I get a kick out of this document, a summary by points. In the following years, after his success in convincing a great researcher and a great thinker, Ramazzini, to do this work, we see Leibniz trying to do this elsewhere. He tries to convince the royal house of France to open up programs, and he writes several papers to princes and stuff, and tries to convince him. He gets some feedback, but that never really takes off. Where he's prime minister in the House of Hanover, he tries to get support from the elector, who then becomes the king of Great Britain, George I. He tries to get support for this kind of program, but the elector of Hanover, soon to be king, says to him that he wants him to continue his historical work on the House of Hanover, okay, and not focus his efforts in this direction. And he also works. He tries to convince Prussia to do this, and here he is successful. But he prepared the terrain. He got people thinking, at least also in France and in Hanover. But in Prussia, under his recommendation, the king of Prussia founded the Scientific Society of Berlin, later of Germany, Leibniz becoming its first president. And he can now lead Germany out of medieval medicine, literally, and into the lead of medicine for the next 200 years, especially in Berlin. For the next 200 years, doctors in France, England, and the United States would routinely go to Germany for their medical education. Only with the development of Johns Hopkins do American doctors begin receiving their medical education in the United States. Before then, it was typically Germany, and it's a direct result of the work of Leibniz. So he establishes a program of medical research, and he lists the types of questions that need to be investigated. They're fun and curious. Let's look at these. So a summary of points, it's the title of it. So it's a fun document. It's written for the Scientific Society of Berlin. So he's using an old German, but German's not developed as a scientific language yet. So it's sprinkled with a whole bunch of Neo-Latin, and sometimes even in a single word. So you have to really kind of untangle the text. When I translated here, it doesn't look like that in the original because you're actually mixing two languages at the same time. Now, he really understood the questions that needed to be asked. So he lays out this program concerned not merely with better treatments, but also prevention. Again, it's public health, it's broader, and preventative treatments for the whole population. Quote, "For their prevention and curing, nothing can be more useful than to evaluate the present by the past and learn the cause of the evil by the experience of the past. As many things coming from the past show regular consequences if one correlates climatic conditions and other particularities of the year. In order to learn the nature of the evil, its art and manner, its signs, its course, its crises, its prognostics, its results and remedies, its harms and aids, we would best proceed by means of a fittingly constant effort, which would consist in annual observations as well as their recording and collection, as there already exist some praiseworthy samples from learned and experienced doctors, especially by Mr. Ramazzini and Mr. Breslauer." All right, so you get the idea. Now it's point one. Look at the climate. Okay, climate and disease. What kind of diseases do you get according to the climates that you live in? Again, that had not been a question that was ever really asked. They talked about bad air, local things, but they weren't looking at climate and whole populations. Two, what kind of animals are you eating? Your meat sources, all right? Very in accord with what Leibniz was getting, it was soon discovered that eating pigeon is a bit toxic. People routinely had eaten pigeons previously without any hesitation. Point three, what kind of vegetables, eat your fruits and vegetables. I don't know if he actually did that, but he understood, study the plants that they eat and how that correlates to the different disease patterns. Case studies, all right, write up case studies. Now, this is an interesting one. His idea of doing case studies was picked up again by an Italian doctor, Northern Italy again, Morgani. And in 1705, directly again in communication with Leibniz, he began developing this series of case studies. And this lasted a huge time. He actually only stopped it and published it in 1761. Again, it's a document I've read some of these case studies, and they're wonderful. One of the things that's wonderful about the case studies of Morgani is it's amazing how people used to live in the past when you read this. I mean, sometimes these guys would have boils growing from their body the size of a basketball, and they're still going to work and going about their business. You know, things that today we would be completely incapacitated. And yet it's surprising that people would just continue on with their life. Most of the case studies into the death of the person. Most of them, you know, and that's also important. They did not know how to treat these things. And Morgani really laid down exactly what transpired. And even today, doctors can instantly recognize what the disease was, what went wrong, because of the detailed description. The fifth point deals with curiosities, Zonderbarer Dinge, odd tidbits, okay? And what he's describing here, we now recognize is genetic anomalies. And he wants us to understand better how these genetically anomalies arise for a deeper understanding of the human organism. And as sometimes happens with Leibniz, he's perfectly right on this, but he's way, way too early. It really takes an understanding of genetics. The questions he was asking, we begin answering only in the 1970s. But he wanted them studied, and they began to be studied that early. The sixth and final point is your lifestyle. Do you drink too much? Do you go to Caesar's Pizza too often? Okay, do you lay out in the sun too much, so you're going to have skin issues, et cetera, et cetera. So he's looking at lifestyles within the population and their relationship with diseases. It's good, okay? It's a good study. And it seems simple to us today. That's hard, but you have to always remember where we're at. People are still looking at your four humors, bloodletting, you know, and this seems obvious to us because we've completely adopted it. But at the time, he had to really fight to bring it about. And he's not the only person to have these ideas, but he's uniquely well placed as both a scholar and a politician to bring about the actual advances that he's concerned with, that he has the ear of doctors, of politicians, both of them really does help get medical programs up and running. In Berlin especially, but in other areas, he pushes them to go forward. That's most of what I want to say. I want to finish something with a curious question. And this I just love. Do doctors need to know anatomy?
Yes.
I sure hope at least a little bit.
It feels like a trap question.
Okay. Would help.
Studying bones, surgery, okay. But for treating disease, has an understanding of anatomy, this is a trick question. For treating disease, has an understanding of anatomy ever really helped doctors treat disease in a better way?
I think I would still say yes. Because diseases like interact with different parts of the body, right? Such that you would want to, you might want to have an understanding about how like the lungs work if you want to like resuscitate somebody, and that can be the result of a viral disease or a bacterial infection or whatever. But you would also want to like understand how the lungs work if you wanted to put somebody on a respirator for COVID-19 and so forth. To develop that technology in the first place, maybe you didn't necessarily require an anatomical understanding, but surely that helps.
It seems so commonsensical, William, but it's really hard to find examples of people using anatomy in the treatment of disease. It's more double-blind studies. That works. Cool. We'll continue. Yeah. Another double-blind study. Oh, that works better than the previous treatment. Cool. We'll continue. The mRNA vaccines are the clearest example that I have found of anatomy directly inspiring a treatment of disease. Most of the time, it's just been more or less happenstance and trying different drugs. And we see that this mentality of trying hydroxychloroquine, What's that other one that the one that the horse dewormer that people got off using, whatever it was, ivermectin? No, it wasn't ivermectin. I forget whatever they were using, but in some ways people were just doing stuff like that. And anecdotally it works because normally you get better and then you test it. Oh, it doesn't work, or it does, and you go forward. Yeah. But what's fun?
Your wife says it is ivermectin, actually. She commented in the chat.
Okay, all right. So it's ivermectin. And basically it's just you test different things and you see what works. But with the mRNA, that was based upon a detailed understanding of cell anatomy, and it worked. But it's really hard to find a previous example. And it's kind of an interesting moment because Leibniz has an argument with a great doctor named Georg Stahl. And Stahl basically, and for really good reasons in this correspondence that they have going back and forth, Stahl argues that anatomy has been largely useless. He has gained nothing from knowing anatomy, nothing from studying anatomy in his treatment as a doctor. So as he says, few contemporary treatments depended on anatomical knowledge. But here's Leibniz's response, and I just think this is brilliant. But the arguments which are brought forward in order to prove this are almost always founded on the present state of medical science, which is up until the present in a state of infancy. That's it. See, Stahl thinks he's exercising this ancient art. Leibniz is saying, look, okay, I get it. Anatomy is useless to you guys at present, but one day we're going to have COVID-19 and we're going to have to develop these mRNA vaccines, and that's going to require anatomy. Now, he didn't quite use those terms, but that was the general point that he was trying to get across, and how it really kind of plugs into where we're at today. And great things are to be hoped for in the future from this understanding. Quote, one can also hope for a great advance of medical science over time, and the more it becomes perfected, the more the usefulness of a carefully studied anatomy will appear. Future orientation again. So the opinion of Stahl isn't absurd for his time. If we don't understand how to intervene and correct the functioning of the body's organs, what's the point of studying them? And the superiority of Leibniz to an excellent doctor. I mean, Stahl is obviously, when you read this correspondence, he's extremely clever. And Leibniz knows this. But Leibniz's superiority on the future utility of a knowledge of anatomy comes from this characteristic of his thought, which is turned toward the future, but not just the future 20 years from now or 100 years from now, but the far distant future, and his role as being much more modest. And this kind of trait, I think, comes in part from a really solid understanding of not just history, but Leibniz also understood paleontology and what we sometimes refer to as deep history. He understood that life on Earth, not necessarily human life, went back millions of years. He might have been the first person to have that understanding. So he was conscious of existing at a moment in history with a past that he knew rather well, and with a future for which he suspected certain ideas would be useful. And he wanted to contribute to those. Among these ideas that he thought would be useful for the future are a system of binary mathematics, numbers, which he developed, his work on a simple and efficient notation for logic, which didn't fully bear fruit, but that he was working on, and he knew had to be overcome for the development, essentially, of what we today refer to as information technology, and also the knowledge of human anatomy. In Leibniz's formulation, metaphorically, and I like this formulation, these are some examples of trees which we plant and, quote, of which we will not eat the fruit. No, that's his idea. That's his idea of what a scholar should do and what a scholar is about. All right, how can I stop my share here? Stop in the show and stop share, there it is. All right, that was my, any questions, reactions?
Several, but I wanted to make sure we platform everybody equitably.
he probably saved a ton of lives. Like all things considered,
Yeah.
In the last 400 years, it seems like he probably had a great effect on the world.
Which is especially not knowing himself medicine, you know, that's what's fun with it. So again, the calculus is easy. He can sit down and figure it out. He can't do that for medicine, you know.
The point about anatomy kind of jumps out at me, because what's striking about it is that, yeah, like Leibniz is especially a term toward the future, but it seems like what he was observing, or speculating would happen was that our anatomical understanding, contemporary with himself, was essentially a roadmap, right? It was just a chart of where the bits are within the body. From that chart, over several centuries, we developed what can be understood as like a proper mechanistic understanding of that self-same anatomy. So it was like, yeah, he wound up being correct. But I want to phrase it in that way, that our understanding didn't like become useful just by the passage of time. It became useful as it became more detailed and became more like a real understanding. And I think that's kind of the point.
You muted yourself.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I don't know how I did that. Understandings became more useful, technologically speaking, as they became more detailed, and that seems to have been the transformative process. The shift eventually from the careful study of correlations to the ability to mechanistically understand and predict behavior from the human body, and maybe from like all systems generally, but we haven't gotten there with every system yet.
You know, interesting question to ask as well. Did he want to improve the life? How much did he want? Okay, how to word this? Because the answer here could still be affirmative, I guess. So if we ask ourselves, did he want to improve the life of his contemporaries? I think we'd have to say yes. But I think it's more interesting, did he want to improve your lives? And was he aware of trying to improve your lives today? And that's the interesting one that I think was also very much in his mind. You know, he wanted to, because he knew what binary mathematics, I can't do this stuff. You got to figure out the bloody machines here, okay? So, 300 years later, yeah, you guys can figure it out 300 years from now, and it'll improve your lives. It won't do anything for, we're gone. But I think that's a curiosity that I find with him, that he was really also trying to move humanity forward in a way that would ultimately benefit people when he's long gone.
To that question of, was he trying to sort of benefit our lives? I don't know, like with the remark that, medicine, and, it's in its infancy, it might be out of its infancy now, but I don't know that 300 years puts it into its adulthood. If anything, his concern might be people 1,000 years from now, more than us, really.
Exactly. Yeah, it's good, and that's something I'm glad you got that, Daniel. That's something I am trying to communicate. And maybe we're not in our infancy anymore, but we're still toddlers.
We speak in 3-word sentences.
And that it does bring about a little bit of a modesty about what we're about and what we're doing. And also,
I want noodles.
But it's also a sense of hope. I find it a very hopeful message, because that indicates, if you see how much progress we made in 300 years in understanding many areas, and then magnify that by as much as we could do in 30,000 years, you begin getting a sense of, wow, we really could have an interesting destiny.
I kind of think I try to think of ethics and politics in the same way. Leibniz obviously was focused chiefly on, at least in scholarly work, he was focused, he seems to have been focused chiefly on developing systems that we would later use to build different technology, and less so with the concepts that we're using to govern ourselves and our lives. But I think we can understand that historical trajectory the same way for both parts of this, where over time we become better at governance, as long as we do this project of trying to improve it with a long-term view. And by governance, I mean our concepts about morality, our ethics, our ways of administering public policy, et cetera, et cetera.
Steven Pinker's argued that, and I think rather successfully, actually. And another book I like a lot that's a bit neglected, called Factfulness, really measures how much progress we continue to make, and it tends to be neglected because test scores improving, people getting electricity and indoor plumbing throughout much of the world. It tends not to make the evening news, but is actually a big deal for the improvement of our lives.
Gapminder, yeah, plug for Gapminder. Gapminder's good.
Gapminder? I don't know what that is, but I'll look it up.
I don't know if I may have found the wrong results, but I Googled Factfulness and found an article from Gapminder.
Oh, no, it's Hans Rosling. Rosling. Spoiler alert. The hero dies at the end. It seems like the wrong kind of book for the hero to die at the end, but he actually does. And the last little bits of the book are finished by his son. So it was close to being published, but it's Hans Rosling, a Swedish statistician, social scientist, and doctor. Interesting work.
In fairness, the hero dies at the end of every story. We just don't read that far.
Right. Well, yeah. John Maynard Keynes' reflection. In the long run, we're all dead. Yes. Okay, so
that would be Leibniz's view, right? In the long run, we're gonna end. So, like, to give the thing that we're doing meaning, we should make it useful after that point.
Yeah, exactly. Plant the trees whose fruit we will not enjoy. I like that. I like that image.
Blake, I have noticed that you have unmuted yourself. And then if anyone else would like to jump in with anything, feel free to unmute yourself. And yeah, I guess that now I'm gonna stop talking. Blake, go.
In terms of Leibniz cooperation between different people, how do you see that fitting in contemporarily with philosophers? As say we work with public health in modern times.
I saw it really fascinating, and I also thought sometimes the more interesting interactions that I've personally been involved in have been kind of fun when they cross disciplines under a spirit of cooperation and modesty. It was kind of trivial. It was on Twitter of all things, but I had interactions with a guy named Ali Khan, who is an epidemiologist, pretty well known. A research doctor, what was his name? An Italian research doctor, and a statistician who I referred to, Seth Stefans-Stavadovitz. I referred to him in our class recently, and it was.
Have you read the book yet?
Huh?
Have you read the book yet?
His new one? The one not yet. No, I actually you reminded me though. I forgot to look it up this week. I'll have to get a hold of it if it's out. I assume it is. Anyway, but essentially, Ali Khan thought the data for I'll try not to blush, but erectile issues with people who had COVID was a thing, and it was based on that Italian doctor's work. But Seth Stefans-Stavadovitz had not found an increase in Google searches for those kinds of issues in areas with outbreaks, which should show up if it was correlated with that. So when Ali Khan wrote that, I wrote, I said, I'm not convinced because of the work of the social scientist over here. And it was kind of fun because then Seth Stefans-Stavadovitz actually weighed in and said, I kind of wonder if I did that because that actually is an interesting article. I mean, maybe I'll have to look at the data more carefully. Then the Italian doctor weighed in and said, the Italian guy who wrote the original study and said, I'm actually, that's interesting. That's not showing up in the Google data because, I'm finding it pretty, and it was kind of fun that I just kind of played a little connecting role and then watching them going back and forth and exchanging it. I still think it's kind of debatable. There's from what I've gathered, there's some evidence, but people are still hesitant to affirm that particular one. But it was fun to see
to coordinate this person talking with this person.
Yeah, and to see it take place, and to also just catch the spirit of how open it was. Nobody was trying to win the argument in the standard sense of win. Everybody was trying to learn from one another.
Well, that's also an interesting overlay in human anatomy, comparing that with the Google data that you're using, in inverse to a double-blind study that says this drug works. But the Google data says, well, it doesn't say that ED is popping up in these areas that have COVID. How those two things kind of, you're looking at this one viewpoint, but perhaps not. Perhaps there is something there. It's just not. People aren't Googling it.
Right, and that'd be curious. So people Google, and that would be, and that was one of the things that emerged. So they Google, why can't I smell?
Yeah.
Okay. They don't tend to Google, and we have a few women present, but I'll go ahead and say this bluntly. Why can't I get it up? Maybe they're a little bit more hesitant to even do a Google search on that one.
That one.
No one likes admitting that they got problems.
Yeah, so maybe, I don't know, maybe we're still that modest. You would think we would do that Google search, but maybe not.
Masculinity is fragile. I don't find it at all surprising. Or I should say, I would not find it at all surprising that it was in fact correlating with COVID and everything, and just people just weren't Googling it because, yeah, like I said, masculinity is fragile.
Yeah.
Complete aside here, while I have a group of philosophically inclined people here, my co-host Dylan over there, he has deliberately and actively been pronouncing Descartes as Descartes for like 2 weeks now. Can we politely encourage him to stop?
No.
Stop.
Oh, William, who has been doing that?
My co-host who briefly popped by earlier. He's
the podcast?
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh.
Yeah.
Et ma confiance, c'est René Descartes.
René Descartes.
Close enough.
It's an improvement, no?
Yeah, it's close enough. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
The only thing funnier than Descartes is like Descartes pronounced in the most obnoxious French accent you can. So Dylan, if you can switch to that, that'd be ideal.
Descartes. Monsieur comme ça. No, I have a good friend when he came to see me in Paris. Of course, let's go on the Champs-Élysées, and and he would lay out this bonsoir very intentionally. It's gonna be kind of fun to massacre sometimes.
Could a parallel be drawn between Google's not understanding of medicine and Leibniz not understanding medicine, yet both being incredibly useful?
I think so. So what Leibniz was trying to do is get the data. What Google has done, it's given us a tremendous amount of data. And that's a lot, also like thinking fast and slow, the work of Kahneman and Tversky as well. They brought out just a ton of data that I don't think we fully processed yet, what it means and its implications, because it's just so counterintuitive. We run with our Stone Age intuition, and then when we get the data points and it doesn't match, of course, we don't know really what to do with that.
What is that work that you just mentioned?
Kahneman and Tversky wrote a book about how we reason and how we have kind of like two systems of reason. One that's we kind of just like jump to the answer instinctively, and the other one we process it more carefully. But I specifically had in mind some of the work of Tversky, where Tversky demonstrated, for example, that the performance of companies' CEOs measured by stock market performance is perfectly random. And you could see the pattern. So, like, let's imagine, I don't know, you're a pretty big guy. We arm wrestle on Monday. Maybe we're equally matched for all I know. And so maybe I win
I
one.
think you could beat me.
You know, but maybe we're not evenly matched. Maybe you win clearly or I win clearly.
Yeah.
But who wins on Monday is a pretty good indication of who's going to win on Tuesday.
Probably.
Okay, because there's an underlying basis of who's stronger.
Sure.
Now, with stock markets, if there was actually effectiveness operating, you would have one pattern if their decisions were having an impact. But if it's simply purely random, you would have a different pattern. And so you can actually simply compare it. But even in the perfectly random pattern, you'll have some people who will outperform the stock market by luck 10 years in a row. And you'll have some poor guy who will underperform the stock market 10 years in a row, just by coin flips and how many people are doing it. You're going to have those kind of patterns. But of course, we assume the guy who outperformed the stock market 10 years in a row, he's great and he gets this fantastic salary. The guy who underperformed the stock market 10 years in a row, of course, is going to simply be fired. But what Tversky showed is no matter how successful you've been in the past, you have exactly 50% chance in the next year of underperforming or overperforming the stock market.
There.
Yeah, it makes sense.
I mean, there's no shortage of viral videos of like someone picks their stocks by whichever treat their cat goes to, or wherever that means what stock they buy. And lo and behold, at the end of the year, that person has outperformed the market, which seems to indicate that if you just kind of go about randomly while everyone else is trying to make the next big genius play that they can market as a big genius play and are taking stupid gambles, you actually do better than people.
That's slightly separate. That's market research. But I'm talking about the actual CEOs of companies and their action in increasing the stock market value of their company or lowering the stock market value of their company.
Okay.
That's the one that's random. I don't know. I don't know if it's the case. I'd assume that I have heard at least that people who have really a good team of researchers to handle their money can get about 10% a year. Average people can get about 5%. And
well, we are at 8:30 or 8:31 technically. We got a whole extra minute. Anyone has any more questions, absolutely let them out. But I do not wish to keep Professor Pelletti. I know he's got things to do. I know that I have a paper due this weekend for somebody's class that I should put work towards.
I'm trying to get that
course of this weekend.
Okay. All right. Well, maybe I'll let you guys get at it then. But hey, thank you for inviting me. Diana and Shaleya, it was good that you both checked in here. I appreciated that. And it was William. And yeah, that was nice.
Take it easy.
Thank
and
you.
With that, we're gonna wrap up here.
Sorry.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna thank Professor Pelletti. Thank you.
Indeed, absolutely. Thank you, Professor Pelletti, for coming by. Thank you for coming by, Andrea. Was lovely having another voice in the room. Thank you everyone for showing up. This has been the CSUS Guerrilla Philosophy Club. I have been Daniel, your club's unofficial treasurer, and signing off. Stingers up.
All right. Bye, guys.
All right.